Hello, beautiful community. We're going to react to a tweet by Michael McFaul, and the point of it is going to be to ground US citizens, but also all of us, around what happens when your country engages in a war you don't approve of, but you still don't necessarily, want to be careless about your servicemen and women, or careless about the social or hard power of your country on the global stage, and so on. How do you balance all of this? And Michael has done a very unfortunate tweet, but we won't mock it. Instead, we'll use it as a really good opportunity, because it mirrors some of the fuzzy language we ourselves use when we say things like, well, I'm against the war, but I'm behind my troops. So let's read Michael. Once our president makes a decision to go to war, even when I disagree with the decision and process, as is the case in the current war with Iran, I still want our armed forces to win. To date, however, I have no idea what is the definition of winning in this war. And so Michael's got mocked and ratioed by the Russo-Ukraine expert community on Twitter, who have said, Michael, that's exactly what you've accused the depoliticized blob in the Russian population of feeling towards Putin's war. That it's a war they didn't want, but once it started, many of them came to feel, well, we might as well win it, even though we don't know what the war is about or why Putin started it. Now, Michael's an emotional Twitterer, so he has a higher percentage of tweets he regrets. And we need a little bit of empathy and humility here, because even if you gave this app to Aristotle, eventually even he would tweet something performative and foolish. And that's one of the difficult things in our informational environment, that fleeting thoughts that would come and go as you boil the kettle are suddenly getting published, especially if you're a public-facing figure. And there is this performative pressure. It's Thursday evening, and it's time to tell the world that you're in favor of all the good things and everybody else is in favor of all the bad things. Send. So, we're not going to mock Michael. We're going to break down what he says. So if you're a student, undergraduate philosophy student, which almost none of you thankfully are, I might ask you to reconstruct Michael's tweet into its propositional components, even though that necessarily would not exhaustively capture Michael's tweet, because sometimes you just cannot separate the content from the rhetorical clothes of a statement. But Michael says roughly, number one, the president's decided to go to war. Number two, I disagree with the president's decision and the process of how the decision was taken. 3, I want our armed forces to win. 4, I have no idea what the definition of this war is. And so the question arises, what do you mean, Michael, by wanting your armed forces to win if you don't know what the war is about, or what winning might even coherently look like? The problem with what Michael says is number 3, actually. I want our armed forces to win. It's not number 4. So let's deal with number 4 first. If you are a member of the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia, you still have a responsibility to reconstruct for yourself what you think are the causes and reasons for war, and then judge them. In other words, you can't refer to the prevailing general conditions of depoliticization and use them to excuse your own depoliticization. Even in an authoritarian society, it doesn't work like that, because you don't need to go public with this. You can just sit in your kitchen and ask yourself, why do I think is this happening? And what's my view about whether it's good or bad or something in the middle? You've got a responsibility to do that. You can't just plead innocence because you find yourself in a social environment where, for objective reasons to do with various social forces, depoliticization obtains. So that's a very important principle. And the structure of this principle holds across many different domains. So in the same way, I would not in most cases accept from a woman who got dominated on a stage by a chauvinistic male who sort of transgressed over her. I wouldn't accept from that woman a statement that just said, well, what just happened was simply just the exercise of gendered power. And the reason I wouldn't accept that is not because it's false, but because as an embodied individual leading her life, she can't apply a high-level sociological explanation to explain the transaction of an embodied experience, because for her that experience will always be full of questions like, well, this is the third time that he is being rude, it's minute 11, should I interrupt him at this point? How strongly should I interrupt him? Should I try to put him in his place? And if I can't put him in his place, what's stopping me? And maybe if X and Y is stopping me, maybe because I could deal with that and then put this idiot in his place next time. So you see what I mean? As soon as you begin engaging in a first personal way with your environment, it's not that these large-scale sociological explanations become false. It's that they are explanations from a different level of interest than the interest of an embodied individual negotiating the world. So even if you are in the most sort of understandably depoliticized environment on earth, you can't, as it were, plead depoliticization as an excuse for not figuring out what's going on around you and then judging it. Now, in the same way that Russians can do it, obviously Michael can do this too. He can see that a central, but not the only, but a central part of what's going on is that Trump is impulsively reaching for the theatrics of wartime presidency. But why do I think Michael is not guilty in the Twitter tribunal? Too many of our cultural debates at Twitter tribunals, beautiful community. Luckily, that's diminishing. But other problems are getting worse, so it's not that things are going well. But the reason Michael is innocent here in the Twitter tribunal is that fundamentally that fourth thing he's saying, I have no idea what the definition of this word is not about his own epistemic confusion about what's happening. It's actually his frustration that there isn't a clear public statement about what's happening. So that's the generous way to interpret that. And I think that's probably fair, not just generous. He's basically saying, where is the public explanation of this? I'm still waiting for it. He's not really saying, I'm completely confused. I genuinely have no idea about why this war is happening. If that is what Michael is thinking, however, that's bad. But I want to give the benefit of the doubt that is not what's happening here. However, we do have a problem with the third proposition. I want our armed forces to win. And the problem with it is that it is at best evasive, along the lines of other things we often say, like, I'm against this war, but I support our military. Intuitively, as soon as you hear that, you can say, well, okay, I think that there is some way of squaring the two, but surely there's got to be some conflict there too. So how do we think about this? If you are fighting an existential war where the survival of your country is at risk, then almost always, but not always, once the war starts, you back your military. But if you're fighting a discretionary war, a war of choice, that's not the case. If you're fighting a war of choice, whether you are in a democracy or in an authoritarian society, if it's a war you opposed before it started, you have to keep opposing it once it's got going. The fact that the war has started doesn't change your view whether that war is right or wrong. Whether you are in an authoritarian society or in a democracy, it's the same. What's not the same between an authoritarian society and a democracy is, in a democracy, you have to wheel yourself out and actually make that point publicly. You can, vote. You can express your opinion to, neighbors. You can write your political representatives and so on. In an authoritarian society, you wouldn't do that. So in both cases, you have the continuation of your pre-war commitment to the rightness and wrongness of the action. That commitment is not interrupted just because military activities have started. And that's the same in an authoritarian or a democratic society. And in a democratic society, that ongoing critique remains public after the war starts. So it's very important when democracies are prosecuting wars of choice that their citizens criticize them while the war is happening. Now, that largely applies to political decision making. It doesn't straightforwardly apply to the military, because the military does not make political decisions about when to start the war. This can get a bit murky if you're talking about the political leadership of the military, the top of the military, but for our purposes, we can roughly make that distinction. And so that means that you've got to be empathetic to soldiers who have been sent to fight a war that is not justified. In fact, you've got to be especially empathetic to them if they've been sent to fight a war that's not justified, because it's a kind of structural tragedy that they can find themselves in virtue of their profession. So the more wrong the war, unless it's wrong in being so appalling that it's reasonable to ask soldiers to disobey. We'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But especially if the war is wrong, so long as it's not that wrong, you've got to have more and not less empathy for the soldiers in virtue of the wrongness of the war they're fighting. Now, then, of course, arises a question which doesn't apply to what the United States is doing in Iran, in my view, as appalling and as misguided as it is. And that's when you expect a soldier to disobey orders. You obviously don't want your soldiers going around committing genocide and committing massacres. So there's going to be a set of circumstances in which you both want and feel you can reasonably ask a soldier to disobey. However, we've got to be very careful about how far we push this. So what we have to understand is that the military is an institution that makes atomized rebellion difficult, and that most talk along the lines of, oh, well, the soldiers just shouldn't have done it, they shouldn't have gone in, they shouldn't have performed the mission. Most talk like that completely misunderstands the basic sociology of the minimal collective conditions for disobedience. So if you are somehow, without wanting to go and invade Ukraine, in the Russian military on the 23rd of February 2022, and you're ordered to go into Ukraine, and you're surprised by this, the vast majority of you in that position, whatever you might think now sitting on your couch, would go in. And that's because the collective conditions for disobedience are absent. The collective conditions for disobedience would require an ability to coordinate horizontally across some chunks of the army, get help from leadership, genuinely see a prospect of a crack in both military and political leadership, right? So only these conditions for disobedience, if these collective conditions for disobedience obtain, is it reasonable to expect soldiers to disobey without asking them to do something that very few humans would do, which is to do something extraordinary and heroic rather than sort of ethically required and routine. So you've got to understand that on the one hand, we don't want our soldiers engaging in all kinds of crimes against humanity, morally speaking. I'm not talking about jurisprudential norms now. On the other hand, we've also got to realize how difficult it is to disobey orders unless you feel you're going to get some cover from the top. And sometimes you do get that. I mean, for all the war crimes the United States committed in Vietnam, there's a history of disobedience of orders in Vietnam, where orders which were going to lead to huge civilian death tolls were disobeyed and then were not punished within the military hierarchy afterwards. So you've got to ask yourself this really important question. It doesn't really apply to the Iran war, because any military would perform whatever the Orange Monster Child in the White House is asking its military to perform in Iran. But in principle, you've got to understand that it is necessary and possible to disobey, but you've got to be realistic about the sociology of disobedience. So where does this land? Practically where this lands is that you need to understand that it's not okay for people to trick you by building into their conception of supporting the troops winning the war. Right? If your conception of always backing your troops is that you always back all of your country's wars, then your conception of backing the troops is too wide. Your conception of caring for your military personnel needs to be compatible with actually sometimes not wanting the military operation to work out. Now this gets blurry, because one might say, well, might you then not be in a position where you care for your military personnel, but you also potentially are in favor of circumstances that might endanger them more rather than less? That's possible. There are going to be conflicts there, without doubt. But you also have to recognize how much overlap there is going to be. How often, in fact, pursuing victory in a misguided war is going to express itself deleteriously on the lives and livelihoods of military personnel. So accept that in wars that are bad and wrong, you've got to care for your military unless they're going around committing appalling war crimes, very roughly. But that you can't have a conception of caring for your military that's so wide that it leads you to tweet what Michael has tweeted, which is that he wants them to win. Lots of love and talk soon.